Well, thanks. I'm Paul Palmer, and it says that at the bottom of the screen here is, well, besides me is my wife, Leslie. And I was asked by Alan and a couple of other guys from Nature Spot, how about doing a series of talks, you know, Moth of the Month or something like that. And I had a think about that. And they also said, how about doing something for the Microscope Club as well? And I had a little think about that as well. And I have to say, doing the Microscope Club, I know some of you have been along to that. It would be great fun to get that back going again, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. But it was a lovely excuse to upgrade the microscope, which is now beside me here with a very posh camera. So I can now do live things through the microscope, but maybe we can do that on another time. But what I decided to do was and if this works, it'll be one of a number of talks, talk about IDing particular moths that maybe have given you difficulty. They've certainly given me difficulty over the years. So by the way, I mean, I'm presuming if you're here that you have more than a passing interest in moths. And the way I selected the turnip moth to talk about was I had a little look in my store box and had a little look at the moths that are giving me trouble. And you can tell that because there's lots of them. And the turnip moth has appeared more frequently than many. And also it's a member of a particular group of moths, the darts, the noctuids, the darts. And there's a little group of them which are all kind of similar. And knowing how to separate those out gives you a huge lift in your recording activities. Now, so we move on now. So I've told you that I am going to be using set specimens to show you the features. You don't actually need to kill and set the moths because I'm only showing features that you can see on live moths, but you may need to at least use a magnifying glass. Now, if you've been to one of my ID sessions before, you'll know that I'm really keen on using magnifying glasses, low power magnifying glasses when looking at moths. And it's fair to say I use this every single day when I have moths in the moth trap. I had moths in the moth trap this morning, and a little low power magnifier is a huge help in identifying those pesky little bugs. And sure enough, I had a turnip moth in the trap this morning as well, which I thought, well, that bodes well for this day. Now, I suppose I ought to say, well, why is it called the turnip moth? Well, guess what the caterpillar feeds on? Turnips. Had it been named by somebody in southern England, it would have been the Swede, because when I was a kid, what they call further north turnips, we called them Swedes. So anyway, the turnip moth eats root vegetables, basically, and I suppose like anybody, it does very well on root vegetables. It can be found almost any time of the year. So what I'm going to do is, and the reason I put a little video together is I did think if we're going to do some microscope stuff as well, then I won't be able to do everything live. I wanted to be able to stitch together a few little videos and present it as part of a talk. So the idea today is I've got the little introduction I'm giving you now. I'm going to play the recorded video, which was really an experiment to see if I could do it. It's a very stylized format. That way I don't get nervous and I don't forget anything. And after that, the video is only 6 minutes long. After that, we can have a little chat. And if you've all gone by the time I finish playing the video, I know I got it really wide of the mark. So anyway, I'm now going to share the screen. And play you a little video. Hello, I'm going to have a look today at the turnip moth. I'm going to be using a set specimen of the turnip moth because it's a lot easier to show you the features that are needed for a safe identification. However, you should be able to see all of these features using a hand lens on a live moth, although you might need to quieten the moth down a little bit with a whiff of ethyl acetate or carbon dioxide. The moth in Leicestershire is on the wing from April to November, especially June and August to September. Older records indicate a rather more restricted flight period, but even so, the moth is on the wing for quite a long time during the year. So you can get it pretty much anywhere from spring to autumn. As ever with identifying moths, size is one of the most important features. It's always the place that you should start. The set wingspan of this moth is 40.8 millimeters, but the forewing length, which is easy to measure on a live moth, in this case is 17.5 millimeters. This moth is pretty typical in size as well. You might get some that are a little larger, or you might get some a little smaller, but this is the sort of size that you're looking for. The hind wing of the moth is a kind of white, almost pearly white, picked out with blackening on the veins. A particular important point to notice is that there's no spots, which are called stigmata, on the hind wing. So it's a very clean hind wing. And you can see there's just a hint of a border as well. Very occasionally, towards the top inner edge, there may be a bit of a spot or smudge, but there's never a hard spot. On the forewing, there's a number of markings. I've circled the first one here. This is a kidney-shaped mark. These are called stigmata. Notice I'm not going to mention colour. I think you could identify this moth quite easily in black and white. So there's generally this reniform stigmata on the middle third of the wing. There is a circular stigmata just above it. These are nearly always visible on this moth. And finally, there's also a little stigmata that's a little bit dart shaped, but notice in this case it's quite small. It's always less than 2 millimeters in this particular species of moth. The top of the thorax is also plain in this moth. Some of the other moths in this family that are closely related have various sorts of bars and marks here, but notice in the turnip moth it's really plain. If we move to a head view, again this is exactly the same view, you can just see the barest hint of banding, but really it's plain. This is about as strongly marked as it'll ever get in this particular moth. So you're always looking for plain, no markings on the top of the thorax just here. And the antennae are important as well. If we have a close look at the antenna, we see that they're bipectinate, which means they've got two sets of branches, top and bottom, for a good half to 2/3 of the length, and then the end of the antennae is what they call filiform. It hasn't got any branching at all. So this is actually quite an important feature. It's easy to see with a magnifying glass, but if your moth has got feathered antennae to the tip, it's not a turnip moth. If we have a look at the underside, there's not a lot of strong markings on the underside at all. So the fact that it's plain with no stigmata, no significant spots is important. The underside of the hind wing is pretty much the same as the top side of the hind wing, and the underside of the upper wing is very plain. I've circled a little area here which is of interest. Now, moths, the hind wing is linked to the fore wing with a structure called the frenulum and reticulaculum, if I pronounce that right. So the frenulum is the important bit here. It's a little spine. Now, in the females, it always has multiple spines. So the presence of this single spine shows that the moth is a male. And indeed, we would always expect the antennae to be more feathered in a male moth. Most of the moths that come to a moth trap are male for some reason as well. So there's a little structure that's always visible, but only with a hand lens, sorry. And then finally, we have a little look at all the structures that we need to check to make sure we've got a safe identification of the turnip moth. Notice I haven't mentioned anything about crossbars or any other markings. These vary a lot in the moth, but these markings and these sizes are all the things that you need to look out for to safely identify a turnip moth. I hope you find one in your moth trap. Okay, have I stopped sharing now? Yeah, give me a thumbs up if I've stopped sharing. Yeah, that's okay. This is all new to me. So yeah, that's pretty much the way that I approach the identification of any moth. Now, Alan did say to me, "Oh, why don't you do some comparisons?" And there are a few things I would do comparisons on, but most of the time, I would actually work through a standalone list like this. And if you think of it this way, that every time you find something that fits properly, it gives you more confidence in that with your ID. So I never rely on a single feature. Always rely on multiple features. And I've already said I always use a hand lens an awful lot of the time to make sure that I've got an idea. In fact, a lot of the time I've got some moths after we've finished here. I'll be peering at them live under the microscope just to make sure that I'm happy with the ID. Just before I sort of open the floor to some questions, one of the other moths I want to talk about on another occasion is the dark swordgrass, which is very similar in some ways. And this is quite interesting as well, because the description in the Moths of Great Britain and Ireland, that's the big book. You know, this big book here is actually incorrect. As I say, these things aren't actually necessarily easy. And the other point I would say is that for a lot of the adult moths, we tend not to use keys. But the process that I've just gone through of going through multiple features is the very strong discipline that if there was a key to these moths, it would actually take you through it. And I know Alan has you know, sort of had a chat with me before about the identification process. I'm a real believer in a very, very formal process like that. So anyway, that's you know, me and the turnip moth. I'm going to pass the host back to Alan now and let you share any questions. At least you can't throw anything at me here, which is good, isn't it?
We can try. Thanks very much, Paul. That was great. It was a very clear description. However, I have to say, when I'm faced with a trap full of brown noctulids, it's not necessarily the first one that springs to mind. You know, they do all look quite similar. Obviously, you've got some excellent photos there. Your specimen, you know, considerably magnified from real life. At least it is on my monitor. You know, when they're all flapping around in the trap, it's not quite so simple. What would you say were the most commonly confused species with the turnip? You mentioned the dark swordgrass. Any others?
Oh, Struth. Yeah, at times the pearly underwing is quite easily confused as well. The thing with the dark swordgrass, if you always start these things as a process, the one thing you can always be certain of is size. If you encounter a dark swordgrass, which can look visually similar, but it's a much bigger moth. If you then wrote out a list of the moths that were the same size, it's a pretty short list. You end up with dark swordgrass, mother of pearl, large yellow underwing. So if you know, one of the things I always do is use a pencil and I just lift the hind wing of the moth. If in the morning, if they're still a little bit docile, you can often just have a quick peek at the hind wing, and that gives you a load more information to work with. So, I mean, basically, if it ain't got a black and yellow hind wing, it's not going to be a large yellow underwing, is it? So there's things that you can do to reduce it. But in terms of things that get confused, I don't know. In the same family, I remember the very first night I went out mothing with somebody with a Berkeley vapor trap. It was the shuttle-shaped dart that confused me, because it kind of looks like so many different things. And at first I was really confused by that. And that's really when I suppose all the way back then, started to learn that the thing that you must never do is go on colour. Yeah, if you slip down all the, you know, the first thing you notice is colour, there's a trap there. And every time I've made a mistake with identifying moths, it's because I've not allowed for the size and I've been seduced by the colour or some unusual patterning. So I always like to check the size, check the flight period, although flight period you have to be really careful on. I mean, I'm finding moths at the moment that are on the wing 6 weeks early, which is very early, and some things appear to have gone through the winter as well. They look so worn a bit earlier, so they're on the wing at the wrong time of year. So be a bit careful with that. But yeah, when you make other mistakes, it's always size.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. You've summoned them up now, haven't you? You've said large yellow underwing. The trap's just going to be full of large yellow underwings tomorrow morning. They're going to have 100 large yellow underwings to wade through. Anyway, Steve, you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of the turnip moth a little bit like a stretched version of the Heartened Club.
Mm.
I actually had a turnip, and I'm very happy with it as a turnip. The antennae are exactly as you described the other day, but it was virtually missing that third stigmata, the dart.
Yes, that's interesting, because on the photograph that I've shown you, if you were to come around here and look at the specimen under ambient light, it's almost invisible. And I've used a ring flash, which I've set up to give an asymmetric light. And the reason I set it up like that is that it often shows markings that are almost obscured in darker specimens with the naked eye. And the other thing that I had to do with that moth was artificially develop the photograph in the midtones to show it. So Steve, you're absolutely right. So on some of these moths, the markings can be really obscure, But if you can just get the light right with the magnifying glass, you can see the marks. But yeah, when you get a dark specimen, and this applies of almost anything, it can be really hard. And the other thing that can happen, we're having very funny weather at the moment over the, and if the moths get stressed as larvae, you can get some very small forms emerging. So they look perfectly formed, but they're much smaller. And I've only ever seen that in unusual, harsh weather conditions. Now, when I see some specimens like that, if it's something really obvious, like a heart and dart or Cetaceous Hebrew character, I won't dissect it. But I have ended up dissecting turnip moths and some others because, they were just so small. It was hard to believe that was the species.
Okay, well, thanks. Am I able to share my screen, Alan? I've got a...
Yeah, I think so. Steve, can you share your screen?
Well, if I can, I've got this actual moth, a
Try it.
reasonable photograph. No, it's telling me that the host is disabling me from doing it.
You're the host now, Alan.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going to change that. So Steve's the host now. There you go.
I don't know if I'll be able to get it back to you.
You should.
Okay. Can you see that?
Not yet. It's a 2-click process.
Okay. What else have I got to do?
You should see a screen full of windows, and you select the window you want.
No, I can't change it. Oh, just a minute.
Here it comes. Yeah, now we can see it.
So do you see what I mean there, Paul?
Yes.
The antennae are spot on exactly as you described them. It's stretched. It's much longer than some of the other darts. I'm very happy with that as a turnip, but I'm damned if I can really see that dart-like stigmata very well.
It's almost completely obsolete, isn't it? I suspect if you put an angled light on it, you might just see that some of the scales weren't as shiny, and it almost like a ghost of it.
Yeah. That'll be a little difficult now. It's several kilometres away.
Okay, but you're absolutely right. It's good, but it's a really good example of how there's quite a lot of variation in these moths, and that it can be really hard to pick out some of these features. But you're right, in this photograph, it's completely obsolete, isn't it?
Yeah.
You just can't see it. Yeah.
Okay, Alan, what do I do to pass it back without crashing the meeting?
Sorry, it's back with me. Apparently, I can take it away from you. I have the privilege to do that. We've all learned something about Zoom this afternoon. If only we could do that in real life with people, wouldn't that be, I do remember when I first bought my first VCR back in the 1980s and discovered the joy of fast forward, so you didn't have to watch the adverts. And then spending months and months sitting in meetings when someone was droning on, desperately trying to fast forward them, going, come on, not being able to skip it, So any more questions, any more comments for Paul? Hazel? You're muted, Hazel.
I'm basically a botanist. I'm used to using keys. When I started on the moth trapping idea, the fact that we mostly just flip through the book until we find one to match, it seemed really alien. Now, I haven't gone into this in a great deal of detail, but you're saying, Paul, that there are keys available to sort of use a key to identify, things like the pugs. You just sort of look at a pug and look at the pages in your book and think, I haven't got a clue. What book is it you're showing us there that you said have got keys in them.
Okay, I'm going to reach behind me.
Yeah.
And let's have a look. So this is the 10-volume set, Moths of Great Britain. And yeah, it's hideously expensive, but there are keys to certainly the major families in there that are really useful. You'll also know that I do a lot of dissection, and unfortunately there's no keys for dissecting either, which is a real pain. But it's also why I'm really fussy in, people send me specimens, I'm happy, but when they're wet and mushy, they haven't been dried out properly, makes me very grumpy, because I can dissect out the bits, but if I don't know what the adult looks like, I'm just guessing. Whereas if I can measure the wing length and all the rest of it, I can really whittle it down and then get the identification on multiple points.
Is there nothing between like this and that?
The European book, which is cheaper.
Yeah.
This one, I like this one, Laurent, because I always worry that there might be the odd European thing you find. But this one, I'm going to hold it up to you. It's photographs of set specimens, which is quite useful. He's also got some quite good stuff on the genitalia. And it's just useful having a second bite, as I say, because there are mistakes in things. This guy may have mistakes as well.
Is that got keys in it?
There are the odd key here and there, but the keys are usually down to identifying a few in a particular family. I'm afraid it's really a case of somebody wants to start writing some really good keys. There's a complete niche there to do so. I've done a little bit of experimenting writing keys. It's really difficult. There's some great software out there, but at the end of the day, you've got to really put the hours in to do it. And I kind of figured, well, the way I put that talk together on the turnip, you need that level of information for every species that you put in the key. So at least it's made me do quite a lot of research. Now, I mean, I mentioned that I've got material I'm putting together on the dark swordgrass. Turned out that, as I say, the description in Moths of Great Britain and Ireland, that was incorrect. It had an incorrect description of the antenna. My specimen of the moth, a bit like yours, Steve, had obsolete markings. So the black darts, which the books say are diagnostic, it didn't have them, but it had pale ghosts where those marks should be. But when I did quite a bit of research, I found photographs of variations of the dark swordgrass exactly the same as my specimen. But it did take quite a lot of research because I did think, oh, I'm going to show people pictures of this. I need to make absolutely certain I've got it right. Yeah, I was really surprised to find an incorrect description in the book. But this and all the other sources that I found all agree on the nature of the antennae and so forth. But yeah, all the books that you can see on the bookshelf behind you relate to identification mainly of moths and butterflies. A few are on botanical as well, but I'm fairly limited on what I do botanically. But that's my, and there's also birds as well. I mean, I'm really keen on the gulls. And again, when you identify gulls, you learn, well, they're all white, aren't they? So you can't use colour. You have to use shape.
We don't have any
book on gulls as well, you know.
We don't have any keys for gulls either, do we, or birds, as far as I'm aware. So, Steve, you've got a question?
Well, a couple of things. If we're talking about gulls, that's the one you need.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
That's the one. But Hazel's mentioned pugs. I thought I'd add in a couple of things there. I really, especially if you're beginning with pugs, wouldn't try and ID anything that isn't really decent fresh sample. I reckon most of us probably throw away 30 to 40% of the pugs and put them in a basket of common pug, probably. Because, you know, they are so variable, they're difficult. But the major reason I've been able to make some real progress with pugs in the last couple of years is another book. And this one is Hancock's Pugs of Northwestern England. And it is extremely good. It's helped me enormously.
Yeah.
And Paul will now show us his copy.
I haven't got a copy of that. I've got a copy of this one.
Okay.
Which Pugs and Moths by Riley and Pryor. It hasn't got keys, and I have found at least one.
Oh, hold it up again.
This one. And I found at least one mistake in the genitalia plates as well, which is a bit scary. I can't remember where it is, but yeah, the things labelled A, B, C, D, and then the labelling down the bottom, they've got something transposed. Fortunately, it's kind of obvious enough to unpick what's going on, and when you go on and check against the online site, you realise. But the trouble with this is that it does. I think experts, and I'm not an expert on pugs, I don't doubt that people can do it, but as Steve says, it's so difficult. I still take samples of pugs to be certain of the ID. So common pug with a magnifying glass, as you say, if it's well marked, you can be reasonably certain. But I go through taking samples, particularly of the plain little ones, just to figure out what they are. And in this book as well, it suggests, and I can't make it work, that if you look at their bottoms under the microscope, you can ID them from the sternite plates that stick out. So you can just give them a whiff of anaesthetic, pin them loosely upside down, have a look at their bums, and ID them like that. I can't make that work. I don't know if you can make it work, Steve. It doesn't work.
I've never tried.
I can make it work on the November moths, and that they're okay. In fact, if we're ever allowed out again, if I do another session at Rutland Water, I think we caught something like 30 November autumnal moths. And if I took my microscope, I'd be able to do them all in the field under anaesthetic. They're easy. But the pugs, the only way I can see to do them reliably is dissection.
Okay, so we're getting out of sequence now because we've drifted away from the turnip. We're on to November moth, and I was hoping that was going to be moth of the month for November. So we should say that we've covered all the pugs. If we stay here any longer, we'll start on micros. So I think probably for the purpose of the recording, I think it's probably time to thank Paul once again for this. And I'm sure we're all going to be looking out for turnips in our traps over the next few weeks, and there will be a recording of this made available, so we will be able to look back at Paul's excellent description, and I for one will be a lot more confident about identifying the turnip. So with that, I'll stop the recording. Thank you very much, Paul.